The keys were cold against her hip, heavier than they had any right to be, and Eleanor Frayne wore them into a house that believed she was someone else. 12 keys on an iron ring, worn bright at the wards by 40 years of other women's hands, and every one of them a lie she had agreed to carry. The morning was gray over Halcombe Hall, the first frost of October silvering the box hedges below the servants' stair, and she stood in the cold passage outside the master's study, with a tray in her hands and a question she was not supposed to be able to ask. Who had put the bitterness in his cup? She did not yet know his face. She knew only the fact of him, the way one knows the weather is turning before the first drop falls, and she had come to this house under a false name to learn the rest. The bitterness had a name in the stillroom ledgers, though no one had written it there. Foxglove. Dried and ground. 3 grains too many. She had smelled it in the dregs of the cup a fortnight past, when she was still only a stillroom girl at the edge of the county's talk, and she had not been able to unsmell it since. Halcombe Hall belonged to Julian Ashworth, the Earl of Marchmore, and the Earl of Marchmore was dying by degrees in his own morning room, while the whole household called it grief. That was the story the walls told. His wife had died in the spring, a fall from a horse on the North Ride, and the master had gone quiet and gray and thin, and everyone agreed a man might waste that way when his heart had been broken. Everyone agreed. Eleanor did not. She had come with a letter of character that named her Mrs. Eleanor Vane, widow, lately housekeeper to a family in Bath that did not exist. The letter was a forgery, penned by a friend of her late father's who owed the Frayne name a kindness, and asked no questions about why a gentleman's daughter wanted to scrub another man's floors. Eleanor had folded it into her glove and walked up the long avenue of limes, with her chin level, and the old butler Pennycook had looked at her hands and said nothing, and the keys had passed from his palm to hers, as though the house itself had decided. To the household. She was the new housekeeper, brisk and plain and easy to overlook, a woman of perhaps 26 with a plain gray gown and a manner that did not invite conversation. That was the mask. Beneath it, she was afraid in a way she had not let anyone see since the night her own father had died with the same bitterness on his lips, and no one had believed her then either. You may already have guessed that she was not what she seemed. Stay with her a while and watch how a woman learns a house through its keys. Her father had been a physician, a good one, unfashionable enough to treat the poor, and clever enough to be resented for it. He had died 18 months before, in his own chair, after a cup of chocolate a grateful patient had left at the door. The magistrate had called it apoplexy. Eleanor, who had helped him grind his own remedies since she was a child, had held the cup to the light and seen the fine sediment that should not have been there, and had said the word aloud, and had been told by 3 separate gentlemen that grief had disordered her mind. She had buried him with the words still in her mouth. She had learned to grind and dry and distill in earnest. After that, taking work in an apothecary's back room, listening to the county's gossip pass over the counter like water over stone, and when the talk turned to the wasting Earl of Marchmore and the sweetness his new physician prescribed for his nerves, something in her had gone very still. So she had forged a letter, and taken a false name and walked into the house, where a man was being unmade the way her father had been unmade, because she could not save the one, and would not fail the other twice. The keys led her into rooms a still-room girl would never see. The plate closet, the linen presses, the wine cellar with its cobwebbed bottles, the locked cabinet in the still-room where the poisons of any great house lived their legitimate lives, ratbane and laudanum and the tincture of foxglove that a careful hand kept for a laboring heart. She counted the foxglove on her 2nd morning. She counted it again on her 4th. The level in the bottle had dropped, and no illness in the house accounted for it, and she wrote nothing down, because a housekeeper who wrote down the wrong thing would find her letter of character read more closely than it could bear. She met the Earl of Marchmore on her 6th day, and he was not what the story had led her to expect. She had expected a broken man. She found a man holding himself together by main force, tall and spare, in a dark coat that had been made for a heavier frame, his black hair going early to iron at the temples, a hard, clean line to his jaw that grief had sharpened rather than softened. He was 37 and looked older some hours and younger others, and his eyes were the gray of slate under rain. And when they moved over her, they did not slide past. The way a gentleman's eyes slide past a servant, they stopped. They took her in, the plain gown, the level chin, the keys, and something behind them sharpened, as though he had noticed a wrong note in a piece of music he had heard 1,000 times. "You are the new housekeeper," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Vane, my lord," she curtsied the exact depth the role required. "No more." "You count the linen twice," he said. "Pennycook tells me he is not accustomed to being checked." "I am accustomed to being blamed for what other hands lose, my lord. I would rather count twice than answer for a thing I did not do." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and had not been near one in months. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I imagine you would." And he turned back to the fire, and the cup was on the table at his elbow, and Eleanor looked at it the way a starving woman looks at bread. She could not take it, not yet. To seize a peer's cup and cry poison on her 6th day would earn her the same 3 gentlemen and the same disordered mind, and it would warn the hand that mixed the dose. She had learned that much from burying her father. Proof first. Proof a magistrate could not wave away with a soft word about a woman's nerves. So she curtsied and withdrew and stood in the cold passage, with her heart going hard against her stays, and she began that day to learn the house through its keys. The physician was called Dr. Sefton, and the household loved him. He was a comfortable, kindly man of 50, with a round pink face and a manner like warm milk, and he came 3 days a week from the market town to tend the master's nerves, and he was gentle with the maids and generous with the footmen, and never failed to ask the cook after her rheumatism. He prescribed a cordial for the Earl's low spirits, sweet and dark, to be taken each morning and again at night, and he mixed it himself in the still-room with the door open and nothing to hide, and Eleanor watched him do it, with her hands folded and her face empty, and learned nothing, because a clever hand does not poison in front of the housekeeper. The cordial was not the vehicle. She was almost sure of it. The cordial was the misdirection, the sweet dark thing everyone could see, and the true dose went in somewhere else in the one cup no one thought to watch. To the doctor she was furniture. She heard him say as much, not unkindly, to the steward in the corridor on her 2nd week. "A sensible woman," Sefton said, "plain as a post, and twice as steady. Exactly what the house wanted after all its upheaval, a housekeeper and nothing more." Eleanor stood on the far side of a half-closed door with a stack of pressed sheets in her arms, and let the words settle over her like the dust of the linen press, and she was glad of them. Let him think it. A woman he did not see was a woman who could watch him. The house watched her back, though, and not all of it was kind. The Dowager Countess, Julian's mother, kept her rooms in the East Wing and her authority in her spine. Lady Marchmore was past 60 and had buried a husband, and now, she believed, was watching her son follow him, and she had decided several things about the world a long time ago and had never been given cause to revise them. She distrusted the new housekeeper, the way a general distrusts a scout from the wrong regiment. She summoned Eleanor on the 9th day, and looked at her hands over the rim of a teacup, and said, "You have the hands of a woman who has not always kept house. I have kept many houses, my lady. Your letter says Bath." The dowager's eyes were pale and very sharp. "I knew everyone in Bath." "Then perhaps you knew my late employer, my lady. The family was quiet." "Quiet," the dowager repeated, tasting the word, disliking it. "My son does not need quiet. My son needs to be let alone to mourn a wife who was worth 10 of the women this county throws at him, now that he is a widower." She set the cup down. "You will not trouble him with your counting and your questions. You will keep his house and hold your tongue. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, my lady." And Eleanor withdrew, and thought, "She believes it, too. She believes he is only grieving. Whoever is doing this has hidden it even from the woman who loves him most, and that made the hand behind it colder and cleverer than she had let herself fear. That night she could not sleep, and she walked the lower passages with a single candle, learning the dark house the way she had learned it by day. And she found the Earl of Marchmore awake in his study at 2 in the morning, with the fire burned to embers and the cordial untouched at his elbow, and a miniature in his hand. He did not startle. He looked at her in the doorway, candle lifting her plain face out of the dark, and he said, "You do not sleep." "Either." "No, my lord. Come in. Do not stand in the cold." A command, level and certain, and she recognized it for what it was, even as she obeyed the particular way this man had of ordering people toward their own comfort. She came in. She did not sit. He turned the miniature in his long fingers, and she saw it was a woman, fair and laughing, painted in the fashion of 5 years past. "My wife," he said, "Clara. They tell me I'm grieving myself to death." His mouth twisted. It would be a tidy thing, would it not? The heartbroken Earl who could not go on. He looked up, and the slate eyes were suddenly very direct. "You do not think I am grieving myself to death, Mrs. Vane? I have watched you not think it for a fortnight." Her heart stopped and started. She had been so careful, yet she had learned, burying her father, that a lie told to a dying man was its own kind of poison, and she was tired of poison. "No, my lord," she said quietly. "I do not think grief is what is wasting you." The fire ticked. Somewhere in the house a clock counted the half hour. He set the miniature face down on the table, a small, deliberate act, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, as though a weight he had carried alone had shifted to make room for a second pair of hands. "Then we are two," he said. "For I have not thought so for a month, and I have not been able to say it to a living soul, because the one time I tried, the doctor increased my cordial, and my mother wept, and I began to wonder if the sickness had reached my reason." He drew a breath. "Tell me what you know." And because the alternative was to watch him die politely, she told him. Not all of it, not her name, not her father, not yet. She told him about the foxglove and its dropping level, and the bitterness she had smelled once, in the dregs of a cup that was not the cordial and the pattern she had begun to see. That he sickened worse on the days he took something in the late afternoon, the plain dish of broth Dr. Sefton recommended for a weak stomach. Brought up from the kitchen by a hand she had not yet traced, his face did not change while she spoke. Only his eyes moved, going flat and cold and very intelligent. The eyes of a man who has been groping in the dark and has just felt a wall under his hand. "The broth," he said, "I do not know yet, my lord. I only know it is the one thing you take that no one watches, because it is too humble to watch." He was silent a long moment. Then he said the thing that made her understand him, and made the whole shape of the house tilt. "Clara did not fall," he said. "I have never believed she fell. She rode that ride 1,000 times. Yet there was no proof, and a grieving man who accuses the air is only a madman. And so I said nothing and let them bury her, and I have hated myself for my silence every day since." He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time she saw the wound whole. It was not grief. It was guilt, the specific unbearable guilt of a man who had suspected a murder and lacked the courage or the proof to name it, and had watched the killer walk free through his own halls, and now suspected he was next and could not prove that either. "If you are right," he said very low, "then I let her killer stay in my house for half a year, because I was afraid of being called mad. I will not make that mistake twice." "Then we will need proof," Eleanor said. "The kind no gentleman can wave away." "We," he repeated. And there was something almost like warmth under the cold. "Yes, we. You are watching two people decide to trust each other in the dark. Remember how it began. It will matter." They began that night, and they were careful, because the thing they hunted was careful. Eleanor could go where he could not, below stairs, into the kitchen passages, through the 12 locked doors that answered to her ring, and the Earl could see what she could not. The doctor's letters, the accounts, the household's public face. They did not meet openly. She brought his morning correspondence and lingered a moment too long. He asked her opinion on a matter of household economy and listened to more than the answer. And she began, quietly, to substitute. The broth that came up each afternoon she intercepted in the passage, and a portion of it went, not to the Earl, but into a stoppered bottle hidden behind the linen press, and a harmless broth of her own making went up in its place. And she watched over the following week the color come back into a dying man's face by half-degrees, and knew she had found the vehicle. The broth was the how. She still did not have the who or the why or the proof. The bottles behind the linen press became a small, grim library. She had no laboratory, only the still room and the knowledge in her hands. But her father had taught her the old tests, the ones that needed no apparatus but patience and a steady eye. Foxglove leaves a signature in the way the heart is said to labor. But foxglove in a broth leaves a subtler one, a faint sediment, a certain behavior with a silver spoon left overnight. She worked at the deepest hour, when the house had gone to its rest, and the only sound was the settling of old timber, and the far-off cough of the night watchman crossing the stable-yard. She would set the little pewter spoon into the saved broth, and leave it against the tarnish till the church clock struck 3, and by candlelight she would draw it out and tilt it to the flame, and read the film that had gathered on the silver the way another woman might read a letter. Her father's voice came back to her, over those bottles, patient and dry, telling a girl of 11 with her sleeves pinned back, that the poison never lies. It is only the men who lie about the poison. She tested and retested through 6 long nights, and the answer came back the same each time, foxglove and foxglove and foxglove again, until she could have wept from the certainty of it, and she wrote it at last in a private cipher of her own devising, a running hand that looked like a housekeeper's marketing notes to any eye but her own, dates and doses, and the exact hour of each dish, a ledger that would hang a man if a magistrate could be made to read it. She hid it not behind the linen press with the bottles, but sewn into the hem of her second petticoat. Because a woman learns, burying her father, that evidence and the proof of evidence must never sleep in the same bed. Dr. Sefton noticed the Earl's improvement, and he was not pleased, though he hid it well behind his warm milk manner. He increased the cordial. He recommended a stronger broth, richer, twice daily now, for a constitution he pronounced dangerously depleted. And Eleanor understood, with a cold drop of the stomach, that the hand behind this was not a patient hand after all, that it had a reason to hurry. And a hand that hurries is a hand that grows careless. And careless was where the proof would live. She found the why by accident in a locked drawer of the steward's room that her ring opened and her conscience did not quite forbid, not the doctor's papers, the estates, the entail of Halcombe Hall, and the names that stood in line behind the Earl of Marchmore, who had no child. His wife had died childless. If the Earl died childless too, the title and the whole estate passed sideways to a cousin, a Mr. Fore. Crane, who lived economically in town and visited Halcombe 3 times a year, and was on excellent, intimate, long-standing terms with the family physician. Dr. Sefton had been Mr. Crane's man before ever he was the Earl's. The doctor had come to Halcombe on Mr. Crane's warm recommendation, the spring the Countess died. Eleanor sat in the steward's room with the entail in her hands, and the whole ugly architecture stood up in front of her, complete. Clara first, because a wife might yet give the Earl an heir. Then the Earl, slowly as grief, so that no one would look twice. And a cousin waiting in town with a physician's loyalty, bought and paid for, and a title falling into his lap like ripe fruit. It was patient, and it was clever, and it had already killed twice. Once at Halcombe, and once. She was suddenly certain, in a physician's quiet study, 18 months before, when her father had grown too curious about a wasting patient and a sweet, dark cordial in the same market town. She would never prove that last part. She knew it now. All the same, the way she knew her own name, and it turned the cold fear in her to something harder and steadier. She told the Earl the next morning, in the study, with the door open and the broth hour approaching, in the flat, brisk voice of a housekeeper reporting on the linen. He stood at the window with his back to her while she spoke, very still. The stillness of a man holding something enormous in check. When she finished, he said, "Only, Crane dined here in March, 3 days before Clara rode out." His hand had closed on the window frame. He held my wife's chair for her at dinner. He was the first to reach me when they brought her in. "My lord," she began. "I know." He turned. His face was terrible and quiet. "You're going to tell me we still lack proof. A magistrate will read that the broth alone proves poison, but not the hand. That a bottle behind a linen press is a housekeeper's word, against an earl's physician and a gentleman of the family, that I could accuse them tomorrow and be gently, sorrowfully declared as mad as I have always feared I would be." The corner of his mouth moved without humor. "You have a very clear head, Mrs. Vane. Whoever taught you to grind foxglove taught you to think as well." She went still. It was the nearest anyone had come in 18 months to seeing her. And she found to her own alarm that she wanted him to see her, wanted it with a suddenness that had nothing to do with the case, and frightened her more than the poison had. "My father," she said, before caution could stop her. "My father taught me. He was a physician. He died 18 months ago, of a cup of chocolate, a grateful patient left at his door, in a market town not 20 miles from here. And they told me I was mad, and I buried him with the truth in my mouth." Her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that. "I did not come to your house to keep it, my lord. I came because I heard how you were wasting, and I could not save my father, and I would not stand by a second time." The silence stretched. He crossed the room. He did not touch her, though she felt the wish too in the air between them like heat off a stone. He stopped an arm's length away and looked down into her face, and his eyes had lost their slate coldness altogether. "What is your name?" he said. "Your true one." "Eleanor Frayne. Eleanor." He said it the way a man says, a word he means to remember. Low, deliberate, weighed. "You have kept this house safer in a fortnight than I have kept it in 37 years, a breath. When this is finished, I do not want you to leave it." It was not a declaration. It was better than a declaration. It was a fact. He was telling her, the way she had told him her father died, and she felt it land somewhere under her stays and stay there, and she said nothing, because there were no words in her that would come out steady, and he saw that too, and let the silence hold them both. Then he stepped back, and the Earl returned to his face, and he said, "Now, tell me how we get the proof." They laid the trap over 4 days, and it was Eleanor's plan, though he lent it his authority. They worked it out together in the study, after the house had gone dark. 2 heads bent over a single branch of candles, and she found that she had never in her life talked to anyone the way she talked to him, plainly, quickly, without the guard she had worn since her father's grave. He would set an objection, and she would turn it, and he would set another, and she would turn that. And once, when she caught a flaw in her own scheme before he did, and named it aloud and mended it in the same breath, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she had no name for, his chin propped on his hand, the candlelight warm on the hard planes of his face, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Her pulse betrayed her in the hollow of her throat. She was certain he could see it. She bent her head back to the paper and made her voice brisk. And he let her, and took up the next objection as though the small silence had not happened, but his knuckle brushed the back of her hand as they both reached for the same page, and neither of them drew away as quickly as propriety asked. Proof required the hand to be caught in the act, the dose in the broth traced from the poisoner's fingers to the cup, before witnesses. No county magistrate could dismiss. So the Earl of Marchmore did a thing that cost him a great deal. He announced at dinner, before his mother and his steward and the doctor summoned specially, that he was greatly recovered, that Dr. Sefton's cordial had at last done its work, and that he meant to celebrate his return to health with a dinner in a fortnight to which he would invite his cousin Crane down from town. For families should be together at such times. He watched the doctor's pink face as he said it. He saw the flicker. A man restored was a man who would give no more grief deaths, a man who might yet marry again and get an heir, and the flicker told them the hand would move. Now, quickly, before the dinner, before the window closed. It moved the very next afternoon, and Eleanor was ready. She had spent 3 days making herself more furniture than ever, colorless and everywhere drifting through the kitchen passages at odd hours with a candle and an errand always ready on her lips. And she had traced the broth at last to its source. Not the cook, who was honest, a broad red-armed woman who had served 3 generations of the family, and would sooner have cut off her own hand than harmed the master. It was a kitchen maid named Susan, 16 years old and new to service, who flinched when spoken to sharply and whose eyes went too often to the passage that led up to the doctor's room. Eleanor did not frighten her. She sat with the girl one evening over the mending, spoke softly of nothing, of Susan's mother in the next village, of the hard winter coming, and let the child grow easy, and only then, gently, as though it were the smallest thing in the world, asked about the master's special broth. And it came out, all of it, in a frightened rush. The kind doctor had told her the master's broth wanted a particular tonic for his stomach. 3 drops from the doctor's own bottle, stirred in, well, a secret between them, for the master was a proud gentleman and would not take physic if he knew it was there. And Susan was doing a good and loyal thing by keeping it quiet. She had believed every word, of course she had. He had a face made for belief. Susan was not the hand. Susan was the glove the hand wore, and Eleanor's anger when it came was not for the girl, but for the man who had chosen a frightened child to carry his murder up the back stairs. And on the 4th afternoon, Eleanor stood in the shadow of the scullery door with the Earl's steward beside her, a sober, honest man she had spent a week quietly winning. And they watched Dr. Sefton himself come down to the kitchen passage, warm and smiling, and press his little bottle into Susan's hand, and count the drops into the master's broth, with his own fingers 3 drops, then a 4th, hurrying now, careless now, exactly as she had known he would be. "Dr. Sefton," Eleanor said, stepping out of the shadow. He turned, still smiling, the smile only just beginning to understand it was in trouble. "Mrs. Vane, you gave me a start. What are those drops, doctor?" "A tonic for his lordship's stomach, as I have told the girl a dozen times over." "Then you will not object," Eleanor said, "to drinking the broth yourself, since it is only a tonic. His lordship's steward is here to witness it." "As am I." The smile died by inches. And in the small, terrible pause, while the doctor understood that the furniture had eyes, the kitchen door opened and the Earl of Marchmore came in. He had not been meant to be there. The plan had called for the steward and Eleanor and the trapped confession. He had come regardless because he could not stay away, and he stood in the doorway of his own kitchen in his dark coat with the slate-gray eyes gone hard as flint, and the whole room seemed to bend toward him. Susan began to cry. The steward took the little bottle from the doctor's unresisting fingers, and Dr. Sefton, cornered, did the thing that cornered men do, and reached for the story that had always worked, the soft, sorrowful story about a woman's nerves. "My lord, this housekeeper is not well. She has fixed on some fancy, some persecution. I have seen it before in women of a certain sort, a certain age, when the nerves quite overthrow the reason, and they begin to see plots in the very air they breathe. You must not distress yourself by heeding her. Let me send her to lie down, and we will say no more of it." "She is not a housekeeper," said the Earl of Marchmore. The kitchen went silent. Eleanor's heart stood still. "She is the daughter of Dr. Frayne of Wenlow," the Earl said, and his voice was level and carrying, and it filled the low room to its corners, "whom you poisoned 18 months ago, because he grew too curious about your work. And she has done in 1 fortnight what I lacked the courage to do in 6 months. Take him." 12 words that mattered were folded inside the rest, plain as a blade. She is not a housekeeper. He had claimed her before them all, given her back, her name, and her father's, in the same breath, in the very house where she had worn a lie, and he had not raised his voice to do it. Why? The steward and 2 footmen took Dr. Sefton by the arms. He did not go quietly. At first, he talked, the warm milk voice curdling into threats and then into pleading. And none of it caught on anything because the bottle was in the steward's hand and the drops were in the broth, and Eleanor's cipher ledger was already unfolding on the kitchen table under the Earl's flat gaze, dates and doses in a physician's daughter's hand. And the magistrate who came the next morning was a friend of the Marchmore family, and read every page. Mr. Crane was arrested in town within the week. The doctor, faced with the ledger and the broth and the terror of hanging alone, gave up his patron to save his own neck. And it did not save him, but it hanged the right 2 men, and it opened at last the closed grave of Dr. Frayne of Wenlow, whose death was quietly amended in the county records from apoplexy to murder. 18 months too late for the man himself, and exactly in time for his daughter, who had promised him the word she was never allowed to say aloud. The Dowager Countess did not apologize. That was not in her. She came to Eleanor's small room 3 days after the arrest. All the same, stood in the doorway with her sharp, pale eyes gone strangely uncertain, and said, "You knew my son was being murdered when I thought he was only sad. I told you to hold your tongue." A long pause. "I was wrong to tell you that." It was the largest thing the old woman had ever conceded to anyone, and Eleanor understood its size, and only inclined her head, and let the dowager keep the shred of dignity she had come to spend, corrected, not broken. The old woman went back to her east wing a little smaller than she had left it, and in time, in her own fashion, she came to guard Eleanor as fiercely as she had once distrusted her. There was a great deal of talk in the county, of course. The wasting earl who had not been wasting, the plain housekeeper who had been a physician's clever daughter all along, the murder under the roof of Halcombe Hall. The talk for once ran the right way, because the crowd that had once believed Eleanor mad now believed her brave, and a county that loves a scandal loves a rescue even better. Winter came down over Halcombe before it was truly finished, the way winter does, without asking. And on the first true snow of the year, when the box hedges wore white and the long avenue of limes stood bare and black against a pewter sky, Julian Ashworth came to find Eleanor in the still room, where she had gone to put away the last of the poison cabinet, under a new lock, whose only key hung now on her own ring and no one else's. He had put on flesh again. The dark coat fit him now. He stood in the low doorway of the still room with the snow light behind him and watched her turn the key in the cabinet, and he said, "You mean to keep the keys, then?" "Someone must, my lord. This house has learned it cannot be too careful." "Julian," he said, "in this room at least, I have called you Eleanor for a month in my own head. I would like to hear my own name back sometimes." He came in. He was not a man who reached for people. She had learned that. His whole life had trained him to hold himself apart, to command comfort toward others and take none himself. So it cost him, and she saw that it cost him, when he crossed the small stone room and stopped close enough that she could see the gray had gone from under his eyes, and lifted his hand, and did not quite touch her face, his fingers hovering a breath from her jaw as though asking a question he had no words for. "I told you I did not want you to leave this house," he said low. "I find I did not say the half of it. I do not want you to keep it as its housekeeper. I want you to keep it as its mistress. I have been alone in these rooms since before Clara died, if I am honest. Alone even when she lived, and I did not know it was possible to be seen the way you have seen me until you walked up my avenue with a forged letter and a face that gives away nothing and eyes that miss nothing at all." His breath was uneven. "I am asking you to stay because I want you, Eleanor. Not for the house, not for an heir. For the woman who could not bear to watch a stranger die, and so saved my life. Tell me to step back, and I will. I would rather you did not." She did not tell him to step back. She lifted her own hand and closed the last small distance he had left open, laid her fingers against the hovering hand and pressed it to her cheek, and felt him let out the breath he had been holding as though he had been holding it for months, for years. And when he kissed her at last in the cold, clean still room with the snow ticking at the high window and the poison-locked safe behind them under her own key, It was soft and slow and full of everything that neither of them had been able to say in a house full of listening walls. A promise more than a claiming. And she felt the whole cold length of the last 18 months, finally, quietly. Set down, the keys were warm now, warm from her body, no longer heavy at all. They were married in the spring in the small church at the foot of the Lime Avenue, and the county came, and the dowager wore her husband's diamonds, and dabbed at her sharp old eyes, and told anyone who would listen that she had known from the first that the girl had good hands. Eleanor let her tell it. It cost nothing, and the old woman needed her small revisions of history. And Eleanor had learned long ago that a person can be corrected without being crushed. She kept the keys. She was mistress of Housekeeper Hall, and she wore the housekeeper's ring at her hip, still all 12 keys and the new 13th. And the household grew used to a mistress who counted the poison cabinet with her own hands, and knew the difference between foxglove and comfrey by the smell. No cup was ever again brought into that house that some careful eye did not see poured. Julian teased her for it, in the low, private voice he kept for her alone, the nearest that grave man ever came to laughter. And she let him, because his teasing was its own kind of miracle, a man learning late in life that he was allowed to be glad. On the anniversary of the day she had walked up the avenue with a lie folded in her glove. He gave her a small thing wrapped in silk, and she opened it and found a miniature, not of Clara, but of her own father, painted from a description she had given once in the dark and had not known he had remembered. Dr. Frayne of Wenlow, with his kind, unfashionable face and his physician's hands, brought back onto ivory by a man who understood exactly what it was to be haunted and exactly what it was to be, at last, unhaunted. She set it on the still-room shelf, above the locked cabinet, where she would see it each morning when she took down the keys. And some evenings, when the work was done, and the snow came down over the box hedges the way it had come down the night he first said her name, she would stand a moment in the doorway of that small stone room and look at her father's face and feel the ring warm at her hip, and know that the words she had carried in her mouth for 18 months had been spoken and heard and believed, and that the man who had believed it was waiting for her by a good fire in a house that was at last entirely safe. Thank you for staying with Eleanor to the end. If her long patience moved you, leave a word below and tell me the moment you felt the house turn. Outside, the snow went on falling, soft and certain over Housekeeper Hall.